March 2019. The cold bit deep along the Maumee River waterfront in Toledo, Ohio. Detective Sarah Brennan watched as the excavator's claw broke through the concrete foundation of the old Hansen Marine Supply Warehouse, a building scheduled for demolition to make way for luxury riverfront condos. When the foreman radioed in, his voice shaking, the crew had been working for 3 hours. "We found something. You must view this." Beneath 6 inches of industrial concrete poured sometime in the late 1980s, wrapped in deteriorating canvas tarps, lay 2 sets of skeletal remains positioned side by side and clutched in the bones of what appeared to be the left hand of one victim, a gold class ring with the initials JLH, which stood for Jill Louise Hansen. This was the same ring that was mentioned in the missing persons report that was filed on July 23, 1988. For 31 years, the disappearance of Jill and Julie Hansen had been Toledo's most haunting, unsolved case. 2 inseparable sisters who vanished without a trace during the summer before their sophomore year of college. 2 empty seats at every family gathering. At the University of Toledo, a memorial bench with 2 names engraved on it was never used for extended periods of time. The discovery beneath the warehouse floor wasn't just the resolution of a cold case. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would tear apart one of Toledo's oldest families and reveal that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who sit across from you at Thanksgiving dinner. Because when detectives finally made an arrest in August 2019, it wasn't a stranger or a drifter passing through town. It was the girl's uncle, David Hansen, co-owner of the very warehouse where his nieces had been buried for over 3 decades. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. On March 14, 2019, a metallic odor wafted through the early morning air along the Maumee River. The sickly sweet smell of industrial decay mixed with the hope of a warmer spring. Toledo, Ohio was in the midst of another transformation. This one driven by developers who saw opportunity in abandoned warehouses and crumbling brick facades that lined the waterfront. The old Hansen Marine Supply Building at 1847 Front Street had stood empty since 2015, a reminder of Toledo's more prosperous manufacturing era. Its loading dock was silent, and its windows were boarded. Detective Sarah Brennan had driven past the building 100 times without giving it a second thought. On this particular Thursday morning, she was responding to what dispatch had logged as a routine construction site call. During preparation for demolition, human remains may have been found. The foreman's voice on the radio had been steady, professional, but there was something underneath it that made Brennan drive faster than necessary. The excavator sat motionless, 20 feet from the building's south wall, its claw suspended in mid-air as if frozen by what it had uncovered. Construction workers stood in a loose semicircle, hard hats in hands, faces pale despite the morning cold. Jerry Kowalski, the site foreman, met Brennan at the perimeter fence. His hand shook as he lit a cigarette. "We were breaking up the foundation to prep for the new pours," Kowalski explained, exhaling smoke that vanished into the gray March sky. "Standard demo work." On the southeast corner, the claw cut through the concrete and unearthed something that wasn't concrete or rebar. Brennan followed him across the muddy. A section of industrial flooring had been peeled back like the lid of a sardine can on the construction site. The concrete layer was 6 inches thick, poured over what appeared to be compacted earth and gravel. But it was what lay beneath the broken concrete that stopped Brennan mid-step. Two forms wrapped in what had once been heavy canvas tarps, now rotted and discolored by decades underground. The excavator's claw had torn through one of the tarps, exposing what was unmistakably human bone. Ribs, a partial spine, and something that caught the weak morning sunlight with a dull golden glint. Brennan pulled on latex gloves and knelt beside the exposed section, careful not to disturb the surrounding area. The ring was still attached to what remained of a skeletal hand, the bones thin and delicate. She used her phone's flashlight to read the engraving on the band. J.L.H., Class of 1987, Central Catholic High School. The air seemed to leave her lungs all at once. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. Brennan had been 11 years old in the summer of 1988 when Jill and Julie Hansen vanished. She remembered the posters about missing people that were displayed in every store window in Toledo when she was a child. Two identical faces smiling from beneath the word "missing" in bold red letters. She remembered her mother holding her hand tighter when they walked through parking lots that summer. Remembered the way adults would stop mid-conversation when children asked where the Hansen twins had gone. Brennan, a detective, stood, slowly, pulling her phone from her jacket pocket. "This is Brennan. I need crime scene unit, the coroner, and Lieutenant Davis at 1847 Front Street immediately. And get me everything we have on file for Jill and Julie Hansen, missing persons case from July 1988. The dispatcher's voice came back after a long pause. "The Hansen twins case?" "Yeah," Brennan said, her eyes fixed on the broken concrete and what it had hidden for 31 years. "I think we just found them." By noon, the construction site had been transformed into a secured crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off a 100-foot perimeter. 2 white forensic tents had been erected over the excavation site. News vans lined Front Street, their satellite dishes extended toward the gray sky like mechanical sunflowers seeking light. The story was already breaking on social media. Human remains found at former Hansen Marine Supply warehouse. Dr. Michael Chen, Lucas County's chief medical examiner, worked methodically inside the larger tent, photographing and documenting every detail before the remains could be moved. Detective Brennan stood outside, watching through the tent's open flap as Chen's team carefully excavated around the 2 forms. "They were placed side by side," Chen said, not looking up from his work. "Deliberately positioned, not dumped or hidden in a panic. Someone took time with this." Lieutenant Frank Davis arrived at 12:45 p.m., his face grim. In 1988, he was a rookie patrol officer and one of dozens who searched Toledo streets for the missing twins. "You're sure it's them?" Brennan showed him a photo on her phone. The ring, clearly visible, the engraving legible even after 3 decades underground. Jill Louise Hansen, 19 years old when she disappeared. This was her class ring. It was listed in the original missing persons report. Davis stared at the image for a long moment. The warehouse. Who owned it in 1988? Hansen Marine, supply family business. Brennan pulled out her notebook. Founded in 1952 by Walter Hansen. By 1988, it was being run by his 2 sons, Thomas Hansen, father of the twins, and David Hansen, their uncle. Where's Thomas Hansen now? Dead. Heart attack in 2010. But David Hansen is still alive. He's 73, lives in Sylvania. David ran the company alone from the time Thomas retired in the early 1990s until it closed in 2015. Davis looked back toward the forensic tent. "So, we've got 2 bodies buried under 6 inches of concrete in a warehouse owned by the victim's own family. That concrete wasn't original to the building," Brennan said. "I checked with the city planning office. The warehouse was built in 1961. That floor was wood over concrete foundation. Building permits show a concrete pour was done in late July 1988 for floor reinforcement and waterproofing. The permit was filed by Hansen Marine." The 2 detectives looked at each other, the implication settling between them like a physical weight. "Late July 1988, Davis said quietly. "The girls disappeared on July 22nd. The concrete was poured on August 1st, 10 days later." Inside the tent, Dr. Chen called out, "Detectives, you need to see this."
They entered to find Chen kneeling between the two sets of remains, now fully exposed. The canvas tarps had been carefully pulled back. Even to Brennan's untrained eye, the positioning was evident. The bodies had been laid out with care, arms at their sides, positioned as if in repose. Both victims show evidence of blunt force trauma to the posterior skull, Chen explained, indicating the back of each skull with a gloved finger. Similar fracture patterns, similar locations. Whatever killed them, it was the same method for both. Quick, probably from behind. They never saw it coming, Brennan said. And there's this. Chen gestured to the second set of remains where a tarnished silver necklace lay across the chest cavity. A small pendant, heart-shaped with an inscription too worn to read with the naked eye. We'll clean it up at the lab, but I'd bet that's identifiable too. By 3 p.m., news helicopters circled overhead. The story was already breaking on social media. Toledo cold case, breakthrough. Hansen twins found after 31 years. Every major network was running archive footage from 1988. Teenage search parties, tearful press conferences, the twins' graduation photos displayed side by side. At 4:15 p.m., Detective Brennan and Lieutenant Davis sat in an unmarked sedan outside a well-maintained colonial house in Sylvania, an affluent Toledo suburb. The lawn was immaculate. A Mercedes SUV sat in the driveway. Through the front window, they could see someone moving inside. "How do you want to play this?" Davis asked. Brendan watched the house. "Careful. We don't have enough for an arrest warrant yet."
This is notification and interview only. He buried his nieces under his own warehouse floor, allegedly, and we need to prove it. They approached the front door together. Brennan rang the bell. The house was filled with chime sounds, melodic and expensive. Footsteps approached. The door opened. David Hansen resembled the person he was, a successful retired businessman enjoying his golden years. Silver hair was neatly cut. His glasses were dangling from a chain that was around his neck. A cardigan that probably cost more than Brennan's monthly car payment. His expression was pleasant, curious, not yet concerned. "Can I help you?" Brennan held up her badge. "Mr. Hansen, I'm Detective Brennan. This is Lieutenant Davis, Toledo Police Department. We need to talk to you about Jill and Julie Hansen, your nieces." Something flickered across David Hansen's face. Not quite fear, not quite surprise. Something older and more carefully controlled. "My nieces," he said slowly. "They've been missing since 1988. Davis stated that he was no longer missing. "We found them this morning. We'd like you to come down to the station to answer some questions." David Hansen stood very still in his doorway, one hand on the frame. His mask moved for a split second. Brennan saw it clearly. The calculation, the rapid assessment, the weighing of options. Then it was gone, replaced by an expression of carefully constructed shock. "Did you find them? Where are they?" He stopped, as if unable to say the word. "They're deceased, Mr. Hansen. They've been deceased for a very long time." Brennan kept her voice neutral, professional. "We found them at 1847 Front Street, the old Hansen Marine Supply Building, buried under the warehouse floor." David Hansen's face went pale. His hand tightened on the doorframe. He whispered, "That's impossible." However, Detective Brennan had held this position for 15 years. She knew what impossible looked like, and she knew what guilt looked like when it had been hiding for 31 years. This was guilt. Toledo, Ohio in the summer of 1988 was a city caught between its industrial past and an uncertain future. The recession of the early 80s had left its mark on the manufacturing sector that had once made Toledo prosperous. Jeep still operated its massive plant on the city's north side, but smaller operations had closed or downsized. The waterfront, lined with warehouses and shipping facilities, showed signs of neglect, even as civic leaders spoke optimistically about revitalization and economic diversification. For families like the Hansens, who had built their wealth during Toledo's boom years, 1988 felt like a pivot point. Hold on to tradition or adapt to change. Maintain the family business or pursue new opportunities. It was a summer of transitions, of endings and beginnings.
For Jill and Julie Hansen, it should have been a summer of promise. Instead, it became the summer they disappeared. The Hansen family history in Toledo stretched back 4 generations. Walter Hansen, the twins' grandfather, had arrived from Wisconsin in 1949 with a used pickup truck, $400 in savings, and an understanding of boats that came from growing up on Lake Michigan. He started Hansen Marine Supply in a rented garage on Summit Street, selling marine equipment, boat parts, and fishing supplies to Toledo's recreational boating community. By 1961, business had grown enough to purchase the warehouse at 1847 Front Street. The location was perfect: direct access to the Maumee River, proximity to Lake Erie, and enough space to expand inventory and add a small repair shop. Walter ran the business with his wife Dorothy until his sons were old enough to join. Thomas, the younger son, joined the ship in 1968 after serving in Vietnam for 2 tours. David, 4 years older, had been working at the warehouse since graduating high school in 1964. The business prospered through the 70s. Toledo's economy was strong, disposable income was high, and recreational boating on Lake Erie was experiencing a golden age. Hansen Marine Supply became the go-to source for serious boaters throughout Northwest Ohio. Walter retired in 1980, leaving the business to his sons. He passed away in 1985 without realizing that his family's legacy would be linked to one of Toledo's most infamous crimes. Thomas Hansen had married Karen Novak in 1967, shortly before his deployment to Vietnam. They'd grown up 3 blocks apart in the old West End neighborhood, attended the same Catholic schools, and always assumed they'd end up together. When Thomas returned from the war in 1969, quieter and more serious than when he had left, Karen was waiting. Their wedding at Rosary Cathedral was attended by over 200 guests. Jill Louise Hansen arrived first on March 15, 1969, at 3:47 a.m. at St. Vincent Medical Center. At 3:54 a.m., Julie Marie Hansen appeared 7 minutes later. Identical twins, the doctor announced. The nurses brought them out wrapped in pink blankets, and Karen, exhausted and overwhelmed, looked at Thomas and asked how they would ever tell them apart. "We'll figure it out," Thomas had said, holding both daughters, one in each arm. "We've got a lifetime to learn." Growing up, the twins were inseparable in the way that only identical twins can be. They shared a room by choice, even after Thomas and Karen bought a larger house in the Westgate neighborhood in 1975.
They developed their own language as toddlers, a private communication that frustrated and fascinated their parents in equal measure. They wore matching outfits until junior high, when Julie finally insisted on developing her own style. They were like 2 halves of the same person, Karen would later tell investigators, her voice breaking. Jill would start a sentence, and Julie would finish it. They knew what the other was thinking without speaking. When one got sick, the other felt it. When one was happy, they both glowed. But as they grew older, the differences emerged. Jill, older by those 7 crucial minutes, was the planner and the achiever. She kept meticulous notebooks color-coded by subject. She made lists and checked items off with satisfaction. Julie received reminders from her about assignments and appointments. At Central Catholic High School, Jill was secretary of the student council, captain of the debate team, and a member of the National Honor Society. Her guidance counselor wrote in her college recommendation letter, "Jill Hansen possesses the rare combination of intellectual rigor and genuine compassion that marks the truly exceptional student." Julie was the artist, the dreamer, the one who saw the world in colors and shapes rather than schedules and deadlines. She filled sketchbooks with drawings of Toledo's architecture, the Victorian homes of the old West End, the industrial beauty of the waterfront at sunset. She took photography classes and spent hours in the school's darkroom, capturing moments that her classmates had passed by without taking pictures of, noticing. Her art teacher, Sister Mary Catherine, kept one of Julie's photographs framed in her classroom for years after. A black and white image of rain on a window, each droplet containing a tiny reflected world. The twins remained extremely close, despite or perhaps because of their differences. They attended the University of Toledo together in the fall of 1987,
both living at home to save money. Jill declared pre-med, already planning for medical school. Julie chose graphic design, drawn to the emerging world of computer graphics and digital art. Their freshman year passed in a blur of classes, part-time work at the family warehouse, and the social life of college students in a mid-sized Midwestern city. They dated occasionally, but never seriously. Boys came and went, their roommate from freshman dorm would later recall, but the twins always had each other. I used to question whether anyone would ever be significant enough to stand in their way. The summer of 1988 began with optimism. Both twins had completed their freshman year with strong grades. Jill made the dean's list. Julie's portfolio had impressed her professors enough to earn her a recommendation for a competitive internship the following summer. They'd taken on additional hours at Hansen Marine Supply, working 3 days a week, helping with inventory, customer service, and basic bookkeeping. The warehouse had changed little since their grandfather's time. The main floor held rows of shelving stocked with marine equipment, ropes, anchors, life vests, navigation equipment, fishing gear. The back section housed the repair shop where their father and uncle fixed boat motors and did custom work. Upstairs, a cramped office overlooked the main floor with filing cabinets full of invoices and orders, a desk piled with catalogs, and a window that looked out over the Maumee River. The girls loved working there. Their father, Thomas, would later say, his voice hollow,
They grew up in that warehouse when they were little. They'd play hide and seek among the shelves. As teenagers, they'd help me with inventory on weekends. That summer of '88, they were old enough to really contribute. Jill was learning the accounting. Julie was redesigning our catalog. They were becoming part of the family legacy. The twins' uncle, David Hansen, had always been a more complicated person in their lives. Where Thomas was steady and warm, David was ambitious and intense. He never married, dedicating himself entirely to the business, with a focus that sometimes bordered on obsession. He worked longer hours than Thomas, took fewer vacations, and pushed constantly for expansion and modernization. Uncle David was always nice to us, Julie had told a friend that spring. However, there was something about him that made me feel uneasy, like he was constantly observing or calculating something. Jill had been more diplomatic. He's just serious about the business. From nothing, Grandpa built this place. Uncle David wants to honor that. What neither twin knew, what no one in the family knew, was that by the summer of 1988, David Hansen was drowning in debt. He'd made a series of bad investments in the mid-'80s. Convinced that Toledo's economy was about to boom, he had invested in unsuccessful ventures, purchased property whose value decreased, and been secretly siphoning funds from Hansen Marine Supply to cover his losses. He had also been falsifying records and manipulating the books with ever-increasing desperation. By July 1988, David Hansen was 3 months away from bankruptcy. The only thing standing between him and financial ruin was the hope that Thomas would never discover what he'd been doing. The books were complicated enough, the transactions buried deep enough, that it might take years for the theft to surface, unless someone with sharp eyes and attention to detail decided to look closely at the finances. Unless someone like Jill Hansen, with her color-coded notebooks and her methodical mind, happened to notice discrepancies while helping with the summer accounting. Friday, July 22nd, 1988, began like any other day. The temperature was forecast to reach 92 degrees, typical for a Toledo summer. Humidity hung thick over the city, promising afternoon thunderstorms that never quite arrived. The twins had the morning off, spending it at the community pool with friends before heading to the warehouse for the afternoon shift. They parked their shared Honda Civic in the small lot behind Hansen Marine Supply when they got there at 1:30 p.m. The car was a graduation present from their parents, light blue with a manual transmission that Julie had taught Jill to drive. They'd argued for weeks about whether to name it before finally settling on Blue Lagoon, a reference to a movie they'd watched together as children. Thomas Hansen was already at the warehouse when they arrived, working in the repair shop on a boat motor that had been giving him trouble all week. David was in the upstairs office going through purchase orders. The twins clocked in, grabbed matching cans of Diet Coke from the small refrigerator in the break area, and headed to the office where Jill had been organizing files all week. "Your mother's making lasagna tonight," Thomas called out as they passed the repair shop. "Don't be late." "We won't," they called back in unison. Their voices harmonizing in that eerie way that identical twins sometimes do. Those were the last words Thomas Hansen would ever hear his daughters speak. The afternoon passed quietly. A few customers came and went. A regular named Frank Kowalski bought spark plugs and marine oil. A young couple browsed the fishing equipment for 20 minutes before leaving without purchasing anything. Thomas left David at 4:30 p.m. to take Karen out for an early birthday dinner and wiped his hands on a shop rag before going home to change and shower. "Lock up when you're done," Thomas said to his brother, "and make sure the girls don't stay too late. They're talking about catching that Tom Hanks movie tonight." "I'll send them home by 6, David promised. Thomas Hansen walked out of his family's warehouse at 4:47 p.m. When he returned the next morning, his world would already be shattered beyond repair, though he wouldn't know it yet. The last time anyone who loved them saw Jill and Julie Hansen alive was through the office window upstairs. Working side by side, as they had done their entire lives, two dark-haired figures bent over a desk covered in file folders. Side by side, inseparable, 19 years old with their whole futures ahead of them. July 22nd, 1988. A Friday evening in Toledo, humid and heavy with the promise of rain that wouldn't come. The kind of night when the air itself felt thick enough to touch, when even the slightest movement brought a sheen of sweat.
The sun hung low over the Maumee River, painting the water bronze and gold as it began its slow descent toward the Indiana horizon. At Hansen Marine Supply, the day was winding down. The last customer had left at 5:35 p.m., an elderly man who'd purchased a replacement propeller and spent 15 minutes telling David Hansen about his grandson's upcoming fishing trip. David had listened with practiced patience, nodding in the right places, offering advice about the best spots on Lake Erie for walleye this time of year. Years of customer service had taught him exactly how to project interest while his mind worked on other problems. By 5:50 p.m., David had locked the front entrance and flipped the closed sign in the window. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the rows of merchandise. He stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to the upstairs office, listening to the sounds of his nieces working above, the shuffle of papers, Julie's laugh at something Jill had said, the scrape of a filing cabinet drawer opening and closing. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the sounds of a summer evening at a family business. David climbed the stairs slowly, his footsteps heavy on the wooden treads. Each step was a decision point, a moment where he could turn back, could choose a different path. Years later, forensic psychologists would debate what was going through his mind in those final moments before everything changed. Was it premeditated murder or a crime of opportunity? Had he planned this, or did it emerge from panic and desperation? The truth, as it often is in such cases, was likely somewhere in between. In the upstairs office, Jill Hansen sat at the old oak desk that had belonged to her grandfather, surrounded by file folders and ledgers. She'd been working all week to organize the warehouse's financial records, a task her father had assigned her as a way to teach her practical business skills. Jill approached it the way she approached everything, methodically, thoroughly, with attention to detail that would have made her an excellent doctor someday. Julie sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, sketching in a notebook while keeping her sister company. The small radio on the filing cabinet played top 40 hits. George Michael's Faith had just finished. The DJ was talking about the upcoming weekend weather forecast. Jill had found the discrepancies on Wednesday afternoon. Small at first, barely noticeable unless you were looking carefully. Invoice numbers that didn't match inventory records, deposits that seemed slightly off from the sales receipts, purchase orders for equipment that she couldn't find anywhere in the warehouse. Julie had heard about it, and Julie had suggested speaking with their uncle about it. Maybe it was just a filing error. Maybe there was a simple explanation. "We should tell Dad," Jill had said. "Let's ask Uncle David first," Julie had replied. "No point worrying Dad if it's nothing." On that Friday evening, Jill had finally compiled enough documentation to present her findings. She'd prepared a neat summary, color-coded and cross-referenced, showing patterns of financial irregularities stretching back 3 years. The total discrepancy was approaching $80,000, money that had simply vanished from Hansen Marine Supply's accounts. When David Hansen reached the top of the stairs, Jill looked up from her work. Her expression was concerned, but not suspicious. She trusted her uncle. They both did. He was family. "Uncle David, I'm glad you're here," Jill said. "I found something in the books that doesn't make sense. Can you help me understand these transactions?" She turned the ledger toward him, pointing to highlighted entries with her pen. Julie stood up from the floor, moving closer to see what her sister was showing him. David Hansen looked at the ledger. He looked at his nieces. These 2 young women who looked so much like their grandmother Dorothy, who carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd never known real hardship, who believed the world was fundamentally good and that problems had solutions, and that family could be trusted. And David Hansen made a choice.
The police would later estimate that the entire incident took less than 3 minutes. David was snatched a hefty pipe wrench from the tool rack next to the office door, a tool for minor repairs. The first blow struck Jill from behind as she bent over the ledger, focused on the numbers, never seeing it coming. She collapsed forward across the desk without a sound. Julie had screamed. She turned to run, but the office was small and David was blocking the only exit. The second blow caught her near the door, a desperate attempt to escape that fell short by mere feet. She crumpled to the floor beside the filing cabinet, her sketchbook falling from her hands, pages fluttering like wounded birds. The silence that followed was absolute. The radio continued playing. Rick Ashley's "Never Gonna Give You Up" filled the small office, cheerful and oblivious. Along Front Street, traffic moved outside during the evening. Somewhere on the river, a boat horn sounded. The world carried on as though nothing had occurred. David Hansen stood in his family's office, surrounded by the wreckage of what he'd done. His nieces lay where they'd fallen. The ledger Jill had been examining was splattered with blood. The pipe wrench hung from his hand, suddenly impossibly heavy. The forensic timeline reconstructed later would show that David spent approximately 45 minutes in the office after the murders. He cleaned meticulously, wiping down surfaces with rags and industrial solvent from the repair shop. He gathered the blood-stained documents and burned them in the metal trash can. He wrapped his nieces' bodies in canvas tarps from the warehouse inventory, the heavy-duty kind used to cover boats during winter storage. Jill's class ring had fallen off her finger at some point during those 45 minutes. David hadn't noticed. It would remain with her body for 31 years, a small piece of evidence that would eventually help bring him to justice. By 7 p.m., David had moved both bodies to the back corner of the warehouse, to the southeast section where inventory was stacked highest and foot traffic was lightest. He had set them up in a shallow depression in the dirt floor that had existed since the building's construction, a low spot that had always collected water during heavy rains. Then he drove the twins' Honda Civic to Southwick Mall, 20 minutes across town. After locking the doors, he walked to the nearby Burger King, where he had previously called a taxi, removed their purses from the back seat, and placed them prominently on the dashboard. The cab driver would later remember picking up a middle-aged man who seemed tired and said little during the drive back to the Front Street area. At 9:15 p.m., Thomas and Karen Hansen returned from their dinner celebration, expecting to find their daughters home or at the movie theater. The house was dark. The twins' room was empty. Thomas called the warehouse. No answer. He called the Showcase Cinemas. The ticket seller confirmed that 2 showings of Big had played that evening, at 7 and 9:30. No one matching the twins' description had been seen. At 10:30 p.m.,
Thomas Hansen drove to the warehouse himself, using his key to enter. The building was dark and locked, apparently undisturbed. He called out for his daughters. Only silence answered. He climbed the stairs to the office. The desk was clear, files neatly stacked. The radio was off. Everything appeared normal. Everything except his daughters, who were nowhere to be found. At 11:45 p.m., Thomas Hansen called the Toledo Police Department to report Jill and Julie missing. The officer who took the call noted the time and filed a report, but explained that two 19-year-old women missing for a few hours didn't constitute an emergency. They'd probably gone to a party or stayed late at a friend's house. If you wait until the morning, there will be no relief. The terrible realization that something was catastrophically wrong would be all that morning brought. David Hansen received the phone call from his brother at 1:30 a.m. Thomas was frantic. The girls hadn't come home. Karen was beside herself with worry. Had David seen them leave the warehouse? What time had they left? Had they said where they were going? They left around 6, David said, his voice carefully calibrated between concern and calm. Said something about grabbing burgers before the movie. They seemed excited. I assumed they were meeting friends. Did they say which friends? Thomas demanded. Now, they didn't mention names. Tom, I'm sure they're fine. You know how kids are at that age. But Thomas Hansen had spent 2 years in Vietnam. He was aware of dread, felt like in his bones. He knew the difference between worry and certainty. And he was certain, in a way he couldn't explain, that something terrible had happened to his daughters. He was standing in his living room, phone pressed to his ear, talking to his brother, who was calmly offering reassurance. He had no way of knowing that his daughters' bodies were lying less than 2 miles away in the very warehouse where he'd told them goodbye just hours earlier. He had no way of knowing that the brother he trusted, the brother he'd built a business with, the brother who'd stood beside him at his wedding and his daughter's baptisms, was the one responsible. 20 feet below the office where Jill had discovered the truth, 20 feet below where David Hansen had made his terrible choice, wrapped in canvas, hidden in shadow, already slipping from missing to murdered, though it would be 31 years before anyone knew for certain. Tenth Nove, July 23, 1988. Saturday morning broke hot and cloudless over Toledo.
By 7 a.m., the temperature had already climbed into the high 70s. By noon, it would reach 95 degrees, the kind of oppressive heat that made the pavement shimmer and turned parked cars into ovens. It was the kind of day when most people stayed indoors, air conditioners running constantly, waiting for evening to bring relief. But the Hansen family wasn't waiting for evening. They were looking around. Thomas Hansen had spent the night calling hospitals, friends, anyone who might have seen or heard from his daughters. Karen sat by the phone, clutching a rosary, repeating Hail Marys in a whispered litany that had become almost unconscious. When dawn finally came, Thomas was out the door immediately, driving the route from the warehouse to the movie theater, then to the mall, then to every place he could think of where the twins might have gone. At 8:30 a.m., he called the police again. This time, his tone left no room for dismissal. My daughters have been missing for over 12 hours. This isn't like them. Something is wrong. Detective Raymond Walsh was assigned to the case. A 20-year veteran of the Toledo Police Department, Walsh had handled his share of missing persons reports. Most ended with sheepish teenagers returning home after staying out too late. Some ended with fugitives who had left on purpose. A few ended badly, but those usually involved younger children or obvious signs of foul play. The Hansen case seemed straightforward at first. 2 college-aged women, responsible and close to their family, had failed to come home from work. Their car had been located early that morning by a mall security guard who'd noticed it sitting in the same spot since the previous evening. The Honda Civic was locked, undamaged, with the twins' purses visible on the dashboard, keys in the ignition. It looked staged, Walsh would later testify. 2 purses placed prominently where they'd be seen, keys left in the car, but doors locked. It felt intentional, like someone wanted us to find the vehicle there. By Saturday afternoon, the search had expanded dramatically. Volunteers from University of Toledo joined family, friends, and members of St. Patrick's Catholic Church where the Hansens had worshipped for decades. Over 200 people were carrying photocopied flyers with the word missing in bold letters and photos of the twins graduating side by side. David Hansen was among the searchers. He'd arrived at his brother's house early Saturday morning, his face drawn with apparent worry. He organized search parties, coordinated with police, and spent hours walking the neighborhoods around the warehouse and the mall. To everyone who saw him, he appeared to be a devoted uncle doing everything possible to find his missing nieces.
David was incredible that first week, recalled Patricia Morrison, a family friend who participated in the search. He barely slept. He was always on his phone following up on tips, checking in with search teams. He appeared completely helpless. The investigation focused initially on the gap between the warehouse and the mall. The twins had last been seen leaving Hanson Marine Supply around Sixtiang. According to David's statement, their car was found at Southwick Mall, approximately 20 minutes away by car. Had they driven there themselves? Had someone else driven their car? Why would they leave their purses visible if they'd parked intentionally? Detective Walsh interviewed David Hanson on July 24th, 2 days after the disappearance. The interview took place at the warehouse, David walking Walsh through the building, explaining the layout, the inventory system, the daily operations.
David explained that the girls left together around 6. I was finishing up some paperwork in the office. They came upstairs to say goodbye. Jill said something about being hungry, wanting to get food before the movie. Julie was excited about the film, said she'd heard good things about it. Did you notice anything unusual that day? Walsh asked. Is there anyone around? Any clients who were particularly interested in the twins? Nothing like that, David said. It was a normal Friday. Slow, actually. We get weekend businesses higher. Walsh made notes, but found nothing suspicious in David's account. The man seemed genuinely distressed, cooperative, eager to help. His timeline matched what Thomas Hanson had reported. He was the only family member who saw the twins before they vanished, so there was no reason to suspect him of anything else. On July 26th, a witness came forward claiming to have seen 2 young women who matched the description of the twins near the mall around 6:45 p.m. on Friday evening. They were talking to a man beside a dark-colored van. The description was vague. White male, 30s or 40s, average height. The kind of description that could match 10,000 men in Lucas County. This sighting shifted the investigation's focus towards stranger abduction. Police theorized that the twins had been approached in the mall parking lot, possibly by someone posing as security or claiming to need help. The van assumed primary leadership. Every dark-colored van registered in the area was discovered and looked into. All led nowhere. By August, the case had reached an impasse. Tips poured in from across Ohio and neighboring states. Jill and Julie had been spotted in Cleveland, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh. Each sighting was investigated and dismissed. Their credit cards were not used, and neither of the twins' bank accounts were affected. Their friends insisted they had no plans to run away, no secret boyfriends, no reason to disappear. Thomas Hanson took a leave of absence from the warehouse. He couldn't bear to be in the building where he'd last seen his daughters. While his brother fell apart, David took over day-to-day operations and ran the business alone. In a world of prayer and vigil that would last for decades, Karen Hanson stopped eating and sleeping. On August 1st, 1988, Hanson Marine Supply filed a building permit with the city of Toledo for concrete floor reinforcement in the warehouse's southeast section. The permit listed water damage and structural concerns as the reason for the work. David Hanson supervised the concrete pour himself, hiring a crew from outside Toledo who asked no questions and finished the job in a single day. 6 inches of industrial concrete mixed with aggregate and sealed smooth. 40 square feet covering the depression in the dirt floor where 2 bodies lay wrapped in canvas, hidden from the world, sealed away from light and air and the possibility of discovery. The concrete dried quickly in the August heat. Within 48 hours, inventory was stacked back in its usual place. Within a week, the warehouse looked exactly as it always had. Within a month, even the workers who'd poured the concrete had forgotten the specific job. Just another repair in a long line of maintenance work. By September, when Jill and Julie Hanson should have been starting their sophomore year at the University of Toledo, the case had gone cold. Detective Walsh continued to follow leads sporadically, but the department's resources were limited and other cases demanded attention. The Hanson twins became another entry in the unsolved files, another tragedy without resolution. The first anniversary vigil was held on July 22, 1989, at Rosary Cathedral. Over 500 people attended, filling the pews and spilling out into the summer evening. Father Michael O'Brien spoke about faith in the face of uncertainty, about hope that refuses to die. Karen Hansen sat in the front row, flanked by her surviving family, her face a mask of controlled devastation. David Hansen sat 3 rows back, head bowed, hands folded in apparent prayer. To everyone watching, he was the grieving uncle, the steadfast brother, the man holding the family business together, while Thomas struggled to cope with unimaginable loss. No one suspected that he was praying for his own soul. No one imagined that he carried the weight of 2 murders on his conscience. No one could conceive that the answer to Toledo's most desperate question, "Where are Jill and Julie Hansen?" lay less than 3 miles away beneath the concrete floor of the family warehouse where he worked every single day. The secret held, the concrete kept it, and David Hansen learned to live with what he'd done.
Constructing a false life atop a foundation of lies, just as surely as he'd poured concrete over his niece's bodies. The search continued sporadically for years, but hope faded incrementally, like color leaching from a photograph left too long in sunlight. By 1990, the weekly tip calls had dwindled to monthly, then quarterly, then nothing at all. The case remained open but dormant, active but forgotten, waiting for the claw of the excavator to break it open, which it did 31 years later. Capítulo 5. 3 Decades of Ghosts. The 1990s brought change to Toledo as surely as seasons bring leaves and snow. The downtown core that had thrived in the city's industrial heyday gave way to suburban sprawl. Shopping malls replaced Main Street commerce. The waterfront warehouses, once vital to Toledo's shipping industry, stood increasingly empty as economic forces shifted manufacturing overseas and transportation patterns changed. Hansen Marine Supply survived, but barely. The recreational boating market contracted during the recession of the early 90s. Competition from big-box sporting goods stores cut into the specialized marine supply business. David Hansen, now sole proprietor, after Thomas signed over his share of the business in 1992, adapted by diversifying inventory and cutting costs wherever possible. Thomas Hansen had never returned to regular work at the warehouse after his daughters disappeared. The building held too many ghosts. He would stop by occasionally to sign paperwork or review finances, but these visits grew shorter and less frequent as the years passed. By 1995, he'd severed his active involvement entirely, living off his share of the modest profits while David ran operations alone. My father was a shell after Jill and Julie vanished. Uncle Tom just existed, Michael Hansen, their cousin, recalled years later. He went through the motions of living, but there was nothing behind his eyes. My Aunt Karen held on to hope, but Uncle Tom seemed to accept early on that his daughters were gone. It destroyed him slowly from the inside out. Karen Hansen's hope never wavered, even as rational probability suggested her daughters were dead. She maintained their bedroom exactly as they'd left it that July morning in 1988. Jill's pre-med textbooks remained stacked on her desk. Julie's sketches still covered one wall, held in place with pushpins that had rusted slightly over the years. Every July 22nd, Karen held a private memorial service in her living room. She would light 2 candles, play music the twins had loved, Bon Jovi, George Michael, Whitney Houston, and spend the evening looking through photo albums, talking to her daughters as if they could hear her. Thomas attended these rituals in the early years, but eventually stopped, unable to bear the weight of his wife's unwavering faith colliding with his own certainty of loss. The investigation remained officially active, but effectively dormant. When Detective Walsh retired in 1995, he gave the Hansen file to a younger detective who periodically looked through it, but found little new information there. The case was reassigned 3 more times over the following decade. Each new detective reading through the accumulated reports, finding no fresh angles, filing it back in the cold case storage. The problem with the Hansen case was the complete absence of physical evidence, explained Detective Marcus Webb, who inherited the file in 2003. We had a car with no forensic value. We had witness statements that contradicted each other. We had a gap of time we couldn't account for. Without a body, without a crime scene, we were investigating a disappearance, not a murder. And disappearances are nearly impossible to solve without new information. That new information never came. Tips dried up completely by the late 90s. The annual media coverage of the anniversary went away. By 2000, the Hansen twins had faded from public consciousness, remembered primarily by their family and the handful of people who'd known them personally. David Hansen, meanwhile, had rebuilt his life with meticulous care.
He married in 1993, a quiet ceremony attended by family, including Thomas and Karen, who seemed grateful that at least one branch of the Hansen family tree was moving forward. His wife Susan was a librarian at the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, kind and quiet, with no connection to the tragedy in the family that dominated the late 1980s. They had 2 children, a son born in 1995, a daughter in 1998. David was, by all accounts, a devoted father. He supervised the Little League team of his son, he attended his daughter's dance recital, he hosted holiday gatherings where Thomas and Karen were always welcome, though they rarely attended. He seemed to have become the stable center of a family traumatized by loss. David was the glue that held everyone together, Susan Hansen would later tell investigators, her voice shaking with disbelief. David went to the hospital every day when Tom had his first heart attack in 2005. David was there for Karen when she needed help around the house. He talked about Jill and Julie with such sadness. In his office, he kept their photographs. How could I have lived with him for 26 years and never known? The warehouse continued operating until 2015, though business had declined steadily for years. Online retailers had decimated the marine supply market. The few remaining customers were old-timers who valued David's expertise in the personal service that internet shopping couldn't replicate. But it wasn't enough to sustain the business his grandfather had built. In October 2015, David Hansen closed Hansen Marine Supply permanently. The inventory was sold off at liquidation prices. The equipment was auctioned. The building itself was listed for sale, though it sat vacant for nearly 2 years before a development company purchased it as part of a larger waterfront revitalization project. Thomas Hansen never knew the business had closed. He died in 2010, a massive heart attack while sleeping, his heart finally giving out after 2 decades of carrying unbearable weight. He was 70 years old. The obituary in the Toledo Blade mentioned his service in Vietnam, his decades running Hansen Marine Supply, and his survival by his wife Karen and brother David. It mentioned in a single line near the end that he'd been predeceased by his twin daughters Jill and Julie, who disappeared in 1988. Karen attended the funeral in a black dress she'd purchased for this purpose years earlier, her face composed but distant. She didn't cry. She had already wept for 22 years. At the graveside, as the priest spoke the final blessings, she placed 2 roses on Thomas's casket, one for Jill, one for Julie. Flowers from daughters who couldn't attend their father's burial. David gave the eulogy, speaking about his brother's strength, his dedication to family, his never-ending hope that his daughters would be found. He spoke convincingly, with a broken voice, about the tragedy that had defined Thomas's final decades. Some attendees wept. No one suspected that David's tears were for himself, for the terrible knowledge he carried, for the weight of maintaining a lie for over 20 years. The years between 2010 and 2019 passed quietly for what remained of the Hansen family. Karen lived alone in the Westgate house, declining her son's invitation to move in with his family in Sylvania. She preferred the house where her daughters had grown up, where their presence still lingered in the rooms they'd occupied, the stairs they'd climbed, the kitchen where they'd done homework at the table. She was in her early 70s now, her hair completely white, her movements slowed by arthritis and grief. She attended daily mass at St. Patrick's. She volunteered at the church food bank. She lived a small, contained life, orbiting around an absence that had defined 3 decades.
Michael Hansen, Jill and Julie's younger cousin who'd been 11 when they disappeared, had become a civil engineer. He'd left Toledo for college and settled in Columbus, but returned regularly to check on his aunt. On one visit in 2017, he found her sitting in the twins' bedroom, holding one of Julie's sketchbooks. "Do you think they suffered?" Karen asked him, her voice barely a whisper. "Aunt Karen, we don't know what happened." "I'm their mother," she interrupted. "I would know if they were alive. I would feel it." "They're gone, Michael. They've been gone for 29 years. I just need to know if they suffered." Michael had no answer. No one did.
The questions hung in the air of that preserved bedroom, unanswered and unanswerable, until the excavator's claw broke through concrete in March 2019. David Hansen had retired fully in 2016, selling his home in Toledo and moving to a smaller house in Sylvania. He was 73 years old, a grandfather, a respected member of his church community. He played golf twice a week. He attended his grandchildren's school events. He had, to all appearances, successfully buried his past beneath 31 years of constructed normalcy. But secrets buried don't stay buried forever. Concrete, no matter how thick, eventually cracks. Buildings scheduled for demolition give up their hidden truths. The past, patient and inexorable, waits for its moment to surface. That moment came on a cold March morning when a construction crew began tearing down the old Hansen Marine Supply building when a foreman noticed something wrong with the concrete in the southeast corner. When Detective Sarah Brennan knelt beside the exposed bones and found a class ring engraved with initials that had been listed on a missing persons report for 3 decades, the ghosts that had haunted the Hansen family for 31 years were about to become evidence. The questions without answers were about to find resolution. And David Hansen, who had lived comfortably with his terrible secret for longer than his nieces had lived at all, was about to discover that time doesn't erase guilt, it only prolongs justice. The warehouse that had been his refuge, his hiding place, his daily reminder of what he'd done and successfully concealed, was about to betray him completely. The concrete he'd poured in the terrible heat of August 1988 was breaking apart, and with it, the careful life he'd constructed atop 2 murders. Karen Hansen was 79 years old when the call came from Detective Brennan. She was sitting in her living room, the same spot where she'd sat for 31 years waiting for news. When she heard the words, "We found them, we found Jill and Julie," she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. Not for their return, she'd always known they wouldn't return, but for the end of not knowing, for the terrible gift of certainty, for the possibility, finally, of burying her daughters and saying goodbye. 6. Capitulo, the Reckoning. The forensic examination of the remains found beneath Hansen Marine Supply took 11 days. Dr. Michael Chen and his team worked with painstaking precision, documenting every detail before the bodies could be moved to the Lucas County Coroner's facility. The concrete that had preserved the crime scene for 31 years had also, paradoxically, protected crucial evidence from degradation. DNA confirmation came on March 22, 2019. The remains were definitively identified as Jill Louise Hansen and Julie Marie Hansen. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the posterior skull. Both victims, the fracture patterns were nearly identical, suggesting the same weapon used with comparable force. Death would have been rapid, likely instantaneous, a small mercy in an otherwise merciless crime. But it was the trace evidence that transformed the case from tragedy to prosecution. Soil samples from around the remains contained microscopic particles of a specialized marine lubricant, a proprietary formula used exclusively by Hansen Marine Supply in the 1980s.
The company had purchased the lubricant in bulk from a now-defunct manufacturer in Cleveland, mixing it on-site for use on boat motors and marine equipment. More significantly, fabric analysis revealed fragments of work gloves embedded in the canvas tarps. The gloves contained epithelial cells sufficient for DNA testing. The profile didn't match either victim. It matched David Hansen, obtained from a voluntary sample he'd provided in 2003 during a brief reinvestigation of the case. Detective Brennan built the timeline methodically. On March 25th, she obtained a warrant for David Hansen's financial records dating back to 1988. What she found was a pattern of embezzlement stretching from 1985 through 1988, with the final unauthorized withdrawal occurring on July 20th, 1988, 2 days before the twins disappeared. Bank statements showed David had been diverting funds systematically, using his position as co-owner to manipulate accounting records. By July 1988, he'd stolen approximately $78,000 from the business. In 1988, that represented nearly 2 years of the warehouse's net profit.
The financial motivation was obvious. Later, Brennan testified that David Hansen, facing bankruptcy, and the possibility of embezzlement-related criminal charges. Jill Hansen, with her methodical approach to the accounting project her father had assigned her, was on the verge of discovering the theft. In his mind, he had 2 choices: lose everything if you confess, or silence the witnesses. The building permit filed on August 1, 1988 became crucial evidence. The permit listed water damage and floor deterioration as justification for the concrete work. But city inspection records showed no prior complaints about the warehouse floor. Instead of any of the local contractors that Hansen Marine typically employed, the concrete company that was hired for the task was based in Findlay, which is 50 miles from Toledo. He specifically hired people who didn't know him, who wouldn't ask questions, explained FBI profiler Dr. Elizabeth Navarro, who consulted on the case. The concrete pour served a dual purpose: hiding the bodies and creating a psychological barrier. David Hansen worked in that warehouse every day. He walked over his niece's grave. That takes a particular type of compartmentalization, a disconnect between action and conscience that suggests elements of psychopathy. Detective Brennan and Lieutenant Davis brought an arrest warrant back to David Hansen's Sylvania residence on April 3, 2019. There would not be a polite interview this time. This time the evidence was overwhelming. David Hansen answered the door in khaki pants and a polo shirt, dressed for his weekly golf game. When he saw Brennan's expression, something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like resignation. The look of a man who'd been waiting 31 years for this moment, knowing it would eventually come. David Hansen, you're under arrest for the murders of Jill Louise Hansen and Julie Marie Hansen, Brennan said, her voice steady and formal. You have the right to remain silent. He didn't resist, didn't protest his innocence, didn't ask what evidence they had. He simply held out his wrists for the handcuffs, his face expressionless, as if he'd already left his body and he was far away watching the action. His wife, Susan, emerged from the kitchen, her face confused, then horrified as she registered what was happening. David, what's going on? This is insane. Call Martin, David said quietly, referring to his attorney. Tell them they've arrested me for Jill and Julie. But that's impossible, Susan said, her voice rising. You loved them. You spent years looking for them. David met her eyes for a long moment, and whatever she saw there made her step backward, one hand rising to her mouth. In that instant, the comfortable fiction of 31 years collapsed. The devoted husband, the loving father, the grieving uncle, all of it revealed as performance, as mask,
as lie. The arraignment took place on April 5, 2019, at the Lucas County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with media, family members, and Toledo residents who remembered the case from 1988. Karen Hansen attended, flanked by her nephew Michael and her son-in-law. She wore black, as she had for every significant occasion since her daughters vanished. Her face was composed, almost serene, as if she'd found peace in finally knowing the truth. David Hansen entered through a side door wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles. He kept his eyes forward, never looking toward his family or the gallery. When Judge Patricia Morrison asked how he pleaded to 2 counts of first-degree murder, his attorney entered a plea of not guilty. But there was no conviction in the words, no outrage at false accusation, just procedure, ritual, the mechanical progression toward an inevitable conclusion. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Thornan, spent the next 4 months building an airtight case. The evidence was circumstantial, but overwhelming. The financial motive, the forensic evidence, the suspicious timing of the concrete pour, the fact that David had been the last person to see the twins alive and had the means and opportunity to hide their bodies. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Harold Wilson, the concrete contractor who'd performed the August 1988 floor pour. Wilson, now 76 and retired in Florida, remembered the job vividly. "It struck me as odd at the time," Wilson testified via video deposition. "This guy calls me from 50 miles away, offers to pay cash for a same-day pour, and specifies that we work on a Sunday when the warehouse was closed. He supervised every minute of the work, wouldn't let us take breaks inside the building, kept saying he wanted it done quick and clean. We poured that concrete, smoothed it, and were out of there in 6 hours. He paid in $100 bills." The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was purely circumstantial, that no witnesses had actually seen David Hansen commit murder, that the DNA on the gloves could have been transferred innocently. But the accumulation of facts was insurmountable. The jury saw what investigators had painstakingly assembled, a complete picture of premeditated murder and calculated concealment. The trial began on September 16, 2019, in a courthouse ringed by news vans and protesters holding signs reading, "Justice for Jill and Julie." The proceedings lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from forensic experts, former employees of Hansen Marine, family members and investigators who'd worked the case in 1988 and 2019. David Hansen did not testify. His attorney advised against it, knowing that any testimony would be eviscerated by cross-examination. Instead, the defense rested after presenting character witnesses who described David as a devoted family man, a respected businessman, a man incapable of such violence. But Karen Hansen's testimony demolished any sympathy the defense had managed to construct. Frail and soft-spoken, she described 31 years of waiting, of maintaining her daughter's bedroom, of attending masses and lighting candles and praying for answers that her brother-in-law had possessed the entire time. "He came to my house every Christmas," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He ate at my table. He looked at pictures of my daughters and said how much he missed them. He knew where they were. He knew what he'd done. And he let me suffer for 31 years." The jury deliberated for 7 hours.
When they returned on October 8, 2019, the verdict was unanimous on both counts: a first-degree murderer. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for October 25th. In the interim, David Hansen remained in Lucas County Jail, held without bail. He did not receive visitors except his attorney. His wife filed for divorce 3 days after the verdict. His children released a statement expressing devastation and requesting privacy. The family that David had built atop his terrible secret disintegrated as quickly and completely as the concrete that had hidden his crime. At sentencing, Judge Morrison addressed David Hansen directly. "You murdered 2 innocent young women whose only crime was discovering your theft. You buried them beneath concrete and spent 31 years walking over their grave. You attended vigils in their memory. You comforted their parents while knowing exactly what had happened to their daughters. The cruelty of this crime extends far beyond the act of murder itself. It encompasses decades of deception, of allowing a family to suffer without answers, of living comfortably while your victims lay buried in darkness." She sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. At 73 years old, David Hansen would die in prison. The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff. But the message was clear. Justice delayed 3 decades had finally arrived. Karen Hansen died on February 14, 2020, peacefully in her sleep at age 79. She'd lived just long enough to see her daughter's killer convicted, to attend their funeral mass held in November 2019 at Rosary Cathedral with over 1,000 people in attendance, and to finally close the bedroom she'd maintained for 31 years. Her obituary noted that she was predeceased by her husband Thomas and her twin daughters Jill and Julie Hansen, and that she'd spent 3 decades searching for answers. She never gave up hope, the obituary concluded, and in the end she found the truth she'd been seeking. Jill and Julie Hansen were buried side by side in Calvary Cemetery in the Hansen family plot beside their father. Their shared headstone bears their names, their dates of birth, and a single date of death, July 22, 1988. Below the dates, an inscription chosen by their mother. Following the conclusion of the forensic investigation, the Hansen Marine Supply Building was completely demolished, as they had always been, together forever. The lot remained vacant for 2 years before being developed into riverside condominiums. A small park was created along the waterfront with 2 benches dedicated to the memory of Jill and Julie Hansen. Students from the University of Toledo, where the twins would have completed their education, helped design the memorial space. David Hansen died in prison on January 17, 2023, at age 77. Official cause of death was cardiac arrest, though those who'd followed the case wondered if guilt had finally caught up with conscience. He'd spent his final years in protective custody, isolated from the general prison population after threats to his safety. He never admitted his guilt, never expressed regret, and never explicitly stated what had transpired that July evening in 1988. He took whatever nuances of truth remained to his grave, leaving behind only the evidence that had finally exposed him. Bones beneath concrete, DNA on gloves, and financial records showing theft and desperation. The Hansen case became a touchstone for cold case investigations nationwide. The Toledo Police Department established the Hansen Cold Case Fund, using donations to purchase advanced forensic equipment and fund ongoing investigations into unsolved crimes. Detective Sarah Brennan, whose routine response to a construction site call had broken the case open, became an advocate for never giving up on cold cases, no matter how much time had passed. 31 years is a long time to wait for justice, Brennan said at a law enforcement conference in 2021. But every unsolved case represents a family still waiting, still wondering, still hoping. The Hansen twins deserved justice, their family deserved answers, and no amount of time should ever make us stop trying to provide both. Michael Hansen, the twins' cousin who'd been just 11 years old when they disappeared, established a scholarship fund at the University of Toledo in their names. The Jill and Julie Hansen Memorial Scholarship supports students pursuing degrees in forensic science, criminal justice, and medicine, the fields Jill had dreamed of entering before her life was cut short. "They never got to live their dreams," Michael said at the scholarship fund announcement, "but maybe we can help other young people achieve theirs. Maybe that's how we honor their memory, by investing in the future they never got to see." Toledo changed in the decades after the Hansen twins disappeared. The waterfront transformed from industrial decay to revitalized development. The mall where their car was found closed in 2008, replaced by outdoor shopping centers. Lofts and trendy restaurants were built in the warehouse district. The city moved forward as cities do, carrying its history but not defined by it. But some wounds don't fully heal. Even with time and resolution, the Hansen case remains a reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, how family can betray family, how 31 years can pass with truth buried beneath concrete and lies. It's also a testament to persistence, to the advancement of forensic science, to families who never stop searching, to mothers who maintain bedrooms for daughters who will never return, to detectives who refuse to let cases go cold, to the moment when an excavator's claw breaks through concrete and brings truth, terrible and complete, back into light. On warm summer evenings, visitors to the small riverside park sometimes sit on the benches dedicated to Jill and Julie Hansen, watching the Maumee River flow past, carrying water from Lake Erie out toward the wider world. The benches face west toward the sunset, toward the future the twins never reached. The plaques on the benches are simple, bearing only names and dates. However, those who know the story know what they stand for: the eventual triumph of truth over deception, of justice over time, of memory over silence, and of 30 years of mystery. The Hansen twins are gone, but they're not forgotten. Their case solved, but its lessons enduring. Their voices silenced, but their story still speaking to anyone willing to listen. Justice came late for Jill and Julie Hansen, but it came, and in the end, that had to be enough.